Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam. And for those of you who may not have seen the recent show update, Kelly is taking a break from the show, so this will be my first solo episode. I think I'm going to make this a two-parter and try to keep both episodes a little bit shorter, maybe 30 to 40 minutes, but we'll see. Usually, my judgment on how long an episode will actually take to record is often very wrong. So we'll see how it goes, but let's go ahead and jump right into it. Today we are talking about Polly Klaas. Polly was born on June 3rd, 1981 to parents Mark and Eve in California. She was their only child, and by the age of 2, they had divorced. It sounds like after the divorce, Polly's parents were able to co-parent well. But Eve did have full custody of Polly. But Mark would do anything he could to visit them and spend as much time with Polly as possible. But when Polly was younger, she would move around quite a bit with Eve. And her friends and family believed that, at least when she was younger, moving around so much may have contributed to the fact that she was fairly shy. She would definitely begin to open up later and show her personality more, but for a while she was considered pretty shy. And even though Polly's mom had full custody of her, she still remained close with her dad despite the moving. And Eve would eventually remarry. Polly would gain 3 step siblings, and by 1987 she also had a half sister named Annie. And according to crimelibrary.org, Polly got along with her step-siblings and half-sibling pretty well, but she unfortunately didn't get along with her stepdad. As I mentioned earlier, even though she was described as being shy, she seemed to stand up for herself to her stepdad. And if her other siblings would do the same and stand up for themselves, her stepdad would refer to it as, quote, pulling a Polly. So it really did seem like he was picking on her a bit more than everyone else. As Polly got a little bit older, she had the dream of becoming an actor, and she really loved making people laugh. Crimelibrary.org mentions a time when Polly and her family were eating dinner and her little sister Annie just would not stop crying. And in an attempt just to kind of lighten the mood and make everyone laugh, Polly said, quote, "Gee, that's relaxing." So Polly definitely had this witty talent for humor and sarcasm. But one of her biggest fears was the dark. And understandably, as many, if not most kids are, they're scared of the boogeyman. And her father was a very big comfort to her, telling her that he would always protect her in the dark. In October of 1993, when Polly was 12 years old, she lived with her mom and her little sister, Annie. By this time, her mom had divorced her stepdad, and it was just the 3 of them living 30 miles outside of San Francisco in Petaluma, California. On the night of Friday, October 1st, Polly had 2 friends over from school for a sleepover. And for the most part, this sounded like your very typical 12-year-old sleepover. They had some fun hats that they were wearing and playing around with. They painted their faces to look all spooky since it was entering Halloween season. But one thing people remember in hindsight is a burly bearded man who was walking on the sidewalk outside of Polly's home. And it doesn't sound like he was just walking down the street and minding his own business, but he seemed to be lingering or loitering outside of Polly's house. After the girls played a game of the perfect match in Polly's bedroom, they began to get a bit tired. So Polly wanted to run downstairs quick to get the sleeping bags from the living room. And as she opened her door, she saw a man standing in front of her with a knife. And he said, quote, "Don't scream or I'll cut your throats." The three girls stayed silent. The man asked who lived in the house. Polly responded that she did. And he said that he was just there for some money. He told the girls to lie on the floor, and he tied their hands behind their backs and covered their heads in hoods. He repeated himself, saying that he was only there for money and that he didn't want to hurt them. Polly's friends thought that maybe this was some kind of joke that Polly had set up. A terrifying joke, but they're just doing what they can to reason with what is happening to them. And Polly begged the man not to hurt her mom or her sister. And it was at this point that her friends had realized that this was not something that Polly had set up. She sounded far too scared to have set this up herself. At that point, the man picked up Polly and told her two friends to stay quiet and count to 1,000. Polly's friends ignored the order to count to 1,000. And once he was gone with Polly, they tried to get out of their bindings. And by 10:45 p.m., they were able to run down the hall to Eve's bedroom to let her know that Polly had just been kidnapped. Eve immediately called the police, and they quickly put out a description of the suspect onto multiple radio stations in the area, hoping that someone would see the man and report him in as quickly as possible so they could bring Polly home. As we'll see in this case, there are a couple big things throughout the investigation that potentially had a big impact on the outcome. And this might be the first example of that. The description of the man was not broadcast to every radio station, and many people believe that if it were, this case may have had a very different resolution and gone in a very different direction. So crime scene technicians started to investigate Polly's home. And by 9 a.m., investigators were able to pull a palm print from Polly's bunk bed that belonged to Richard Allen Davis. And it would be a little bit of time before they were able to put Richard Allen Davis as the owner of the palm print. But let's go ahead now and jump into a little bit of Davis's history. He was born in June of 1954, making him 39 at the time of the kidnapping. Davis, like many of the other criminals that we have discussed on the show, had a pretty rough childhood. His parents were violent alcoholics, and when he was a child, his mother's form of punishment was administering physical pain by doing things like burning lit cigarettes or holding his hand to the stove. It wasn't only his mother that was violent towards Davis and his 4 siblings. After his parents divorced when he was 11, he spent some time living with his dad, who also abused him. And from the sound of it, it was fairly frequent, even at one point breaking his jaw. Davis had his first run with law enforcement at the age of 13 when he was arrested for burglary. Then, just a couple months later, he was caught forging a $10 money order and spent a short time in a juvenile facility. About a year and a half later, he was arrested for burglarizing a home. And then the next day, Davis's father turned him and his 2 brothers into law enforcement for incorrigibility, according to fsgate.com. And apparently this is something that his father had done multiple times. And in 1970, he would be arrested again for stealing a motorcycle. This time, Davis's father suggested to the court that Davis enroll in the Army, which the court agreed with. less than a year later, he would have multiple AWOL infractions, fighting infractions, reports of not reporting for duty, and the use of morphine on his military record. He was discharged from the Army just about a year later. I'm not going to get into all of the detail of his criminal record, but let's just say there's a lot. I'll put FS Gates' article in the show notes. They do a great breakdown of his criminal record, incident by incident. But in between there were many incidents of public intoxication, burglary, violating probation, among other things. And within 3 years of being discharged from the Army, FS Gate lists 11 different incidents with law enforcement. Then, in September of 1976, Davis abducted a young woman from a BART station. And the BART is San Francisco's public transit system. Davis attempted to sexually assault this woman, but she was able to get away and flag down a passing car, which luckily had a police officer inside of it. Davis would be caught and arrested for this. And 2 months after the abduction, Davis would attempt to commit suicide in jail. He had no intention of ending his life. In reality, he wanted to be transferred to a state hospital because he thought it would be easier to escape from than jail. And unfortunately, he was right. The hospital made a critical error, categorizing Davis as a voluntary patient and not a prisoner. He was able to escape one night and went on a brutal crime spree. He broke into the home of one of the nurses from the state hospital and beat her in her sleep with a fire poker. Luckily, she survived, but she will forever be altered mentally and medically. He would then break into an animal shelter where he was able to get his hands on a shotgun. He then used that gun to kidnap another woman. Luckily, she was able to escape by rolling out of a moving car, and she also was able to get her hands on a gun and shot 6 shots at Davis. Now, I don't know if he was hit with any of these shots, but that didn't stop him from breaking into the home of a woman. And he was arrested at this point while hiding in a bush outside of her house with the shotgun. And in June of 1977, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years for his escape and crime spree. But then by 1982, he was paroled. So he only served 5 of the 25 years. Davis would go on to commit more violent crimes and be arrested again before kidnapping Polly Klaas in October of 1993. And he was paroled only 3 months before he kidnapped her. So let's go ahead and jump back to the investigation in Polly's case. The investigators were able to find the palm print, but didn't have a suspect to compare it to. And this wasn't information that was released publicly. We'll see that there's a couple things that was not put out publicly that, again, had the potential to impact this case. The morning after the kidnapping, search parties began forming, and the community really came together. A local business owner, Bill Rhodes, who owned a print shop, printed thousands of flyers to make sure the community was aware as possible of the missing girl. And 2 days after the abduction, Polly's case was featured on America's Most Wanted with Polly's description and the description of the abductor provided by Polly's friends. This led to many tips coming in, and the man who owned the print shop, Bill Rhodes, started the Polly Klaas Center, where he helped organize everything out of his print shop business. And at this point, Polly's parents and her former stepfather had all been ruled out by law enforcement as suspects, so they were just doing what they could to bring Polly home. On October 9th, just over a week after Polly had been kidnapped, Winona Ryder offered $200,000 reward for Polly's safe return and apprehension of the kidnapper. Winona had grown up in Petaluma, and while she was watching America's Most Wanted, she saw some videos of Polly acting in a school play, which reminded Winona of when she was a child growing up in Petaluma, going to the same school and acting on the same stage as Polly. So she really felt a connection to this case, and she wanted to do what she could to help. So she donated the $200,000, and she took part in some of the searches for Polly. A couple weeks passed, and there was still no sign of Polly. And publicly, there was still hope that she would be found alive. But behind the scenes, there was much more worry that something truly tragic and horrific had already happened. On October 19th, police almost had their big break. Davis was pulled over for drunk driving. He would be arrested and taken to the drunk tank to sober up. In less than 5 hours, he would sober up, and then he would be cleared to leave. He drove away in his 1979 white Ford Pinto. So unfortunately, during his arrest, neither of their arresting officers noticed the similarities between the police sketch and Davis. And I can say after reviewing the sketch myself, they do look pretty similar. But this also could be a result of what I was discussing earlier, how not every radio station broadcasts the description. Potentially this area where he was arrested may not have known the details of Polly's kidnapping because it wasn't as widespread as we would have hoped. Even though this was worldwide news, celebrities were becoming involved. But having that photo, that police sketch, would have had a big impact, and it's possible that these officers hadn't seen it. About a week after Davis's DUI arrest, numerous celebrities took part in a benefit concert. And one of the most notable celebrities involved was the one and only Robin Williams. In addition to ticket sales to raise money, celebrities auctioned off some of their belongings, and the event raised over $12,000 to help fund the search for Polly. And then just a couple weeks after the concert, on November 11th, the Polly Klaas Foundation was officially formed and given nonprofit status. Mark, Polly's father, very thankful to Bill Rhodes, the owner of the print shop, he decided to make him president of the foundation. And not too long after that, news came forward that a woman was filing a civil lawsuit against Rhodes for molesting her at a young age. Then people quickly learned that Rhodes had previously been arrested for threatening 3 girls with a knife, blindfolding them, and molesting them. He was acquitted for those charges of threatening with a knife, blindfolding, and molesting the 3 young girls, but many people couldn't help comparing those charges to what happened to Polly and her friends at the sleepover. And this caused Rhodes to resign from the foundation and take himself out of the search. Police were able to clear Rhodes as a suspect, but unfortunately his reputation had already been affected and he was having to deal with this additional lawsuit. So he just took himself out of the situation. On November 27th, nearly 2 months after Polly was kidnapped, a woman named Dana Jaffe was walking on her rural wooded property in Simona, California, which is about 20 miles away from Petaluma. Dana had seen the news coverage of Polly's disappearance, and while walking her property with a couple friends, she believed there were some items that were suspicious and potentially could even be connected to Polly's case. She found a black sweater, some red tights that were kind of wound up in a ball and all tangled together, white strips of cloth, an open but unused condom, and a condom wrapper. And while Dana called the police over these items that were definitely important to the investigation, a previous call in conjunction with the items found on her property is what really broke the case and gave the authorities the ability to identify their main suspect. So back on October 1st, potentially early hours of October 2nd, Dana was notified by her daughter's babysitter that there was a strange man on her property. And remember, Dana owns a rural wooded property. So it sounds like it was fairly large and densely wooded. So that would certainly stand out if there was someone standing outside of your home. And Dana makes her way home, told the babysitter that it's okay, go ahead and just leave and go home yourself. And as the babysitter was driving away from Dana's home, she saw the man standing outside of his white Ford Pinto on the side of the road. It appeared that his car was stuck, and the babysitter stopped and just partially rolled down her window an inch or two. And the man came up close to her window. He wrapped his fingers around the edge and the gap, and he told the babysitter that he was stuck and that he needed rope. And this very much startled the babysitter, so she quickly drove off and then stopped at a payphone to call Dana right away and let her know that he is still there. Dana quickly grabbed her daughter and left the home in her car, passing the stuck Pinto on her way out. And she drove to a gas station where she called police. 2 officers went to respond, and they found Davis. They found Davis and they found his Pinto, and it was stuck in the ditch. According to crimelibrary.org, they noticed that Davis was sweating profusely, even though this was an October evening in Northern California. He was very unkempt and had twigs in his hair, but he still seemed pretty calm. He explained that he got his car stuck while sightseeing, which is a bit odd because this is the middle of the night. The officers did check for outstanding warrants, but at the time there weren't any, so they let him go. If they had done a background check, they would have seen his long criminal history, maybe would have asked him a few more questions, and see if there was the possible way to connect him with Polly's disappearance just hours after she was taken. And in addition, Davis was violating his parole when police were with him. One thing with parole is you're not allowed to drink alcohol, and while he was talking with police, he actually cracked open a beer. And so he would have been in violation if they would have looked up his full background check. And as I mentioned earlier, the description of Polly's abductor was broadcast in some areas and not others. There's the possibility that if it was broadcast in the area where Dana or her babysitter were, they would have heard that broadcast on the radio because they both were driving their cars. I don't have confirmation that it wasn't broadcast in the area. Could have potentially been just a fluke where they didn't hear it at that timing. But a lot of people I've seen discuss this piece. So I'm under the impression that they were not broadcast. where Dana or the babysitter would have had the ability to hear. Davis was arrested 2 days after the items were found on Dana's property because investigators were able to match the palm print with the one found on Polly's bed because they finally had a name to compare it with. And then, after his arrest, Polly's friends from the sleepover were able to identify him in a lineup. So they believed that they had their man at this point. But unfortunately, they still didn't have Polly. I do think this is where I am going to end this episode, and we will pick this up next week. This was a little shorter than I had anticipated, but I think this is a really good spot to kind of break, and then we can revisit this next week. So thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, and you can follow and rate our show on Spotify. You can find us on YouTube, Have You Heard About This Case? On Instagram, we're at Have You Heard About This Case Pod. On TikTok, we're HYHATC. Or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.